I started to really get interested in how my own mind worked. My second year of medical school, I was able to go on my first 7 days silent meditation retreat. And I tried to push through. I remember crying uncontrollably on the shoulder of the retreat manager, thinking, oh, I can get into medical school, but I can't pay attention to my breath. And I realized how little control I had over my thoughts and how little I knew about my own mind. 20 years later.
Hello, Dr. Judson Brewer. Thank you so much for being here today with us on Chung Huong Institute podcast. Jed, you have inspired me so greatly, especially with breaking habits and looking at craving from a different angle. And I wonder if before we dive in, if you could introduce yourself and the incredible work you do at Brown.
I'd be happy to. So first, I'm glad to be here with you. My background is I'm an addiction psychiatrist and a neuroscientist. I've been in clinical practice and also doing research on habit change for about 25 years. Also have created some companies and some nonprofit groups to help people change habits. Our most recent one is a nonprofit called Mindshift Recovery.
I was watching one of your videos from Mindshift actually the other day, and just your discussion with craving and with your practice actually with mindfulness. And I just wonder, with so many branches of mindfulness these days, and the West is like mindfulness this, mindfulness that, and then we find out it's actually not mindfulness at all. So how do you disseminate that? Like, how do you work with that? How do you know which direction to take people in the context of mindfulness?
Yes, that's a great question. I'm glad you're asking it because I think we've seen a proliferation of different, let's say, organizations and companies who have used the word mindfulness in different ways. I'll just put it that way. Whether it's for nonprofit or commercial purposes. And I think it gets pretty confusing pretty quickly. So I just focus on actually mindfulness is a concept itself. And, we can even look at the derivations of mindfulness, which to me don't seem that helpful from a pragmatic level. If you look at, I'm not a Pali scholar, from my understanding is that sati, has to do with the word remembering. And that has been translated into the West and in modern culture as mindfulness. And then that's been used in a number of different ways. So what I have found that converges and has been pragmatically useful both in my clinical practice, but also in our research and the programs we've developed is this not even just an idea, but the tangible effect of being curious, of curious awareness. So people talk about mindfulness as this awareness that's non-judgmental. We could really look at the heart of that is curiosity. And if you look at the 7 factors of awakening, for example, the second factor, again, I'm not a Pali scholar, but I was actually talking with a Pali scholar about that word Dhammavicaya, and I asked if it could literally be translated as curiosity. And he thought about it for a while, and he said, yes, that could probably be translated as curiosity. Why do I bring that forward? Because if you look at the 7 factors of awakening, for example, they talk about, well, actually, the first factor is sati, I think. So it's like, how does that fit together with investigation, as Dhammavicaya is often translated, to lead naturally down the road to, joy and tranquility and concentration and equanimity. Well, if you look at, paying attention to something and being really curious about it, it naturally draws us in. And from that, we can learn all of the push and pulls of the mind that come with whatever that is. So for me, pragmatically, I focus on things like curiosity as compared to the concept of mindfulness. I don't know. How does that ring to you?
Yeah, I think when we're not curious, then we've already, quote unquote, lost. Right? If we're not curious, then how can we have any awareness because we're still in a box, stuck?
Yes.
I'm curious, Jed, what's your definition of mindfulness then, with this in mind? At this moment, and I know that definition can change tomorrow,
Sure. I would just say a curious awareness.
Yeah. A lot of the time, when I talk to people about mindfulness, and I've learned within myself that every time I'm like, I'm being so mindful, and I find out where I'm not being mindful. And that's always this doorway into a deeper practice, deeper level of practice. So I feel like the thoughts are always present. They're always there. They're always just like making excuses. So how
Mm.
do you stop the excuses for practice? I mean, I heard your interview, one of your interviews where you mentioned deep suffering brought you into practice, right?
Mhm.
When you entered medical school.
Mhm.
But during that time, I'm sure I'm going to make an assumption here. There have had to been many times where your mind said, no, I must do the X, Y, and Z, learn, study, do whatever, but not practice. So how did you overcome that?
That's a that's a great question. I think when I started to see how little control I had over my own mind, I'd taken a very Western mindset to everything in life, whether it was getting through high school into college and then, you know, trying to do well in college and then, medical school. I had a s what is now proven to be for me a false assumption that just pushing through was actually what helped with things. And it turns out that's more correlation than causation. I was able to get things done and I was pushing, but it didn't mean that the pushing helped me get things done. And I remember it was actually, I think, my second year of medical school. I was able to go on my first 7 days silent meditation retreat. And I tried to push through when the teacher was giving the basic instruction, pay attention to your breath. When your mind wanders, bring it back. And by the third day, I remember crying uncontrollably on the shoulder of the retreat manager, thinking, oh, I can get into medical school but I can't pay attention to my breath. And I realized how little control I had over my thoughts and how little I knew about my own mind. And so this was really helpful in helping me take a step back. And now I can look back, 20 years later and be at and say, oh, this is what happened. But who knows what really happened at the time. I started to really get interested in how my own mind worked. And when I had some basic handle, and I would say it probably took 10 years of kind of beating my head against the meditation wall. I'd go on retreats. I would sweat through t-shirts trying to concentrate. It took me 10 years. It wasn't just like I suddenly woke up in that retreat after a couple of years and suddenly everything was easy. It took about 10 years for me to realize that the force, the effort was not the point. I still remember, I think I was on a month-long retreat at one point, and the teacher was so frustrated with me. She said, "Well, your path to awakening is going to be through striving," because like that was all I knew how to do. And I can say definitively now that striving was not, I mean, I learned how unhelpful striving was from that. But striving certainly did not help. There's this quote attributed to Einstein that says, you can't solve a problem from the same level of consciousness that created it.
Mm.
And so, the level of understanding I had of my own mind was not going to solve any problems. It was actually just going to make them worse and get me stuck. And I had to see, oh, this is a habit pattern of mine. This is stuckness. And this is what striving feels like. And this is what curiosity feels like in contrast to these. And when I kind of started to get a taste of curiosity, there was no going back. it was so different, so much more helpful. And still to this day, I think of it as a superpower.
You remind me of my very first retreat under my master, and I end up having a panic attack the entire day.
Hmm.
5 o'clock strikes, and I'm able to see my master for 5 minutes. And I knock on her door, and I say, "I'm sick. I'm sick. I have a fever." And I had checked my temperature. I had a fever, and when I saw her, the fever was gone immediately. And I saw how my mind is the biggest trickster in that very moment.
It is.
What happens when we begin to unwind these habits, when we begin to truly change the brain? What actually occurs?
Well, here I it goes back. So if we ask what's the psychological mechanism here, I think there are clues to that, if not outright instructions. If you look at, the early suttas where the Buddha is talking about dependent origination. And also, one of the most profound suttas for me was when he was talking about, the gratification, danger, and escape, where he's talking about, it wasn't until I explored gratification to its end that knowledge and vision arose. I don't know if that's the exact quote, but that's how I remember it. And the reason I bring that together with dependent origination is if you look at these 12 links of dependent origination, they line up very nicely with modern day psychology around how any habit is formed through a process called positive and negative reinforcement or reinforcement learning. And I actually worked with a Poly scholar. We wrote a paper on this over 10 years ago now, suggesting that reinforcement learning is actually a rediscovery or reinstantiation of dependent origination. And if you look at dependent origination, the Buddha talks about getting stuck in these samsaric cycles, these habit loops. And in fact, we are fueling them. If you look at, tanha, and then I don't know how you pronounce upadana, if that's the right pronunciation, but that can be translated as fuel or sustenance. And each time we do a behavior based on a craving, based on that tanha, we're spinning that cycle again. So we're feeding it. Whether it's somebody smoking a cigarette when they have a craving, or somebody eating when they're not hungry because they're stressed out, or somebody reifying the sense of self when they have an idea and they think, oh, that's a great idea. I used to have what I would later dub the world's greatest ideas when I was on retreat. My brain did not want to sit, but it was like, oh, here's a great experiment to do. You should get up from meditation and write that down. It took me a while to figure out that my brain, it sounds like, we share some of this. My brain was playing tricks on me. It just didn't want to sit, but it wanted to think that it had great ideas. None of those were good ideas, right? So here, it wasn't until I explored that gratification to its end, seeing that those ideas were just tricks and they were fool's gold, that I became disenchanted with them, exploring gratification to its end. And then I started applying that to habit change. I said, wait a minute, this can't be a coincidence that in modern day, Eric Kandel gets the Nobel Prize, showing that this is such an evolutionarily conserved learning process. And the Buddha wrote about it, saying this is how I awakened. It wasn't jhana, it was dependent origination contemplating this. So we started applying that and having people who are trying to quit smoking pay attention to what smoking tastes and feels like. Oh, tastes like crap. Much easier for them to quit. People overeating. Oh, it doesn't feel good. Much easier to stop overeating. People that are worrying. Oh, we in one randomized controlled trial, we got a 67% reduction in these clinical scores of anxiety in people with generalized anxiety disorder, like people who are very good at worrying. And all of this was just applying that line from the sutta, exploring gratification to its end. We didn't have people turn away from their experience. We had them turn toward their experience so that they could learn how their mind was tricking them, and that those tricks were fool's gold, exploring gratification to its end, and then finding the greater happiness that comes from stepping out of that cycle.
I love that you also mentioned the jhanas here, because I think these days I hear a lot of researchers say, I want to open a lab, or they've already opened a lab where they are exploring different jhana states, and they're claiming to induce these states for others who have never meditated before and such like that. And I think right now in the West, how in the past mindfulness became distorted, right? And now I think in the West, a lot of these concepts with the jhanas and different higher states of meditation are becoming distorted. And I love that you brought dependent origination as connection to mindfulness. And I remember in your text, you say trigger, behavior, result. This is what forms a habit. Mm-hmm. So what's the trigger, behavior, result that forms the wrong view for people?
Well, there are so many. So I would say that's probably very individual. it, but generally speaking, again, we can look to the suttas because they generally hold all the answers to these things. So if you look at the three characteristics of existence, for example, if somebody takes the ever-changing nature of experience and tries to make it not change, they're suffering. And so there can be a trigger that says, I don't want to age. And then we do all this stuff to not age. There's a lot of suffering that comes from that. And I've not seen anybody not age yet, just as an example. If we take, all the different ways that self can manifest and we try to hold on to a sense of self, there's a lot of suffering that comes from that, whether it's just attachment to views or to, being a certain way and somebody comes and challenges that, oh, I'm good at this. And somebody says, no, you're not, suddenly there's this suffering that comes from that. And so we can be triggered, whether it's a thought, whether it's a circumstance, whether it's seeing something, there can be all sorts of things that trigger. And then the behavior can be, I would say the biggest umbrella is some form of selfing, whether we, take ourselves to be an anxious person and we worry, whether we take ourselves to be a smart person and we try to prove ourselves, to others that we're smart, whether we are attached to a story of something that happened to us in the past and then we're the victim of that. It's not to say that we don't honor what has happened in the past, because those conditions have led to the conditions now, in which this mind is living. But it also helps us see that if we hold on to those things, if we try to keep spinning those wheels, we're going to keep suffering. And
Mm.
then the different, just to finish that piece and around the result, at some point, and often at a superficial level, there's some type of reward for our brain. One of the most common ones that I see with people with anxiety is that they have learned that worrying gives them a sense of control or distracts them from the feeling of anxiety. So it feels better than just sitting with the anxiety until they know how to sit with anxiety. And so that feeds back. So the next time they feel anxiety, they worry, and then they become a chronic worrier. So here, we can see how we get stuck in these cycles, and we can also see how we can step out. So instead of worrying, we can learn to bring curiosity in, for example, and be with our experience of anxiety or be with our experience of panic. And like you're saying, we can start to see, oh, this sensation, this thought, whatever, comes and goes. It's not me, and if I don't take it personally, there's a lot less suffering here. So that wisdom through practicing just bringing curious awareness to our experience offers quite a bit of freedom.
Is this lack of curiosity, Judd, maybe the reason why people are so addicted to their suffering? I mean, I feel like we as a human species, we love to make ourselves suffer for no reason.
Yeah. It's a great question. I don't have a great answer. I would say one thing here is that we don't know that there's a better way out. We've been so conditioned to look for those cycles of suffering and to be sucked into them that we think, oh, this is the greatest level of happiness. There's a quote from a Upandita book. I think it was In This Very Life, where he said, people mistake excitement for happiness, and they don't realize the greater joy that comes from peace and things like that. So I think it's that we just don't know that there's something better out there.
Mm.
We are all born with the capacity to be curious, and often that gets conditioned out of us, in our teenage years or young adult, when society says, oh, you have to act like you know something. Well, how about act like you don't know what you don't know? I respect those people a lot more than the people that act like they know what they don't know. So here, societally, I don't think hopefully this is changing, but I don't think being curious is seen as a strength, in a you've got to know it all society. Well, it'll be interesting as, things like generative AI really take larger and larger hold. If anything's going to know facts, especially as these things get better and stop hallucinating as much, you can turn to your phone and it's going to know a lot more than you know from a factual perspective. So what can we do that's uniquely human? We can be curious, and so we can start to lean into that curiosity. We can start to lean into that authenticity. One, we'll already notice that we suffer less by not being on the hook for needing to know everything. So there's a huge relief there. But two, we can start to rediscover the power of curiosity.
I love that. How do we rediscover that power?
I'll practice. I mean, simply, oh, to me, when I work with patients with anxiety, I have them start to recognize that, oh no, that comes with worrying. And then in real time, we'll practice like, what does oh feel like? Does even even now I'm leaning into the screen like, oh, draws us in because we're truly curious about something. So it's a matter of getting that little taste for what that's like and then saying, that's pretty tasty. And then it gets easier and easier to tap into that more and more.
That's such a good perspective to associate taste with feeling.
Hmm.
That kind of feeling, I would say, not all feelings, perhaps. So, a lot of people who I have spoken to, when they practice meditation, they say, "I'm practicing being mindful, and it's making me anxious." So there's a lot of confusion between mindfulness and meditation. It's brought together, and then it's brought together with anxiety. And I'm curious, what's the number one advice maybe that you can give to those who say that when they practice meditation, it's just a form of anxiety? And I think I know you're going to say curiosity, but maybe something else.
Well, if somebody's meditating, the first thing I would ask them, this is it's hard to give general, guidelines, but I'd really try to get a sense for how much they understand how their mind works, right? Because if people don't understand these basic processes, and I'm going to say this might sound strange, this basic process of dependent origination, and for me, that was like really hard to understand for a long time. And when we simplify that, not oversimplify, but when we simplify it down to these, what are the basic building blocks of dependent origination, you can actually simplify it to trigger behavior result. Almost anybody can understand that. I've never had a patient not be able to understand that in 30 seconds. So if somebody doesn't know the habit pattern or these habit loops, whatever they are, of their mind, they don't even have to know which ones they are yet. They just need to know the process. I would say good luck meditating because I'm not sure what you're meditating on or how you're meditating. And so that's the first question I would ask somebody is, because I see this all the time when people are like, oh, I'm meditating. Okay, well, what exactly are you doing? You're trying to stop thinking, which is one thing I did for years. It's like just trying to force myself to pay attention to my breath. I didn't know why I was supposed to pay attention to my breath. But when I started to understand, oh, can I see this habitual pattern in my mind and just get curious and start to see these links like, oh, I have this thought that's pleasant and I want more. And so I have more thoughts like that. I don't need to do anything except pay attention and follow that pattern. And guess what? That pattern is going to reveal itself, suffering.
Mm-hmm.
I still remember, it was a long time ago, but I was on a retreat and I started to see pleasant thought leading to craving. And then I started to also see unpleasant thought leading to craving, like aversion.
Yeah.
And I was blown away. I went to the teacher and I was like, oh, pleasant leading to craving. They both lead to the same thing, craving, and craving sucks. And the teacher smiled at me and said, yep. It's like, you finally saw that. But until I saw it myself, I couldn't start to see how that was actually causing suffering. And then I became much more interested in noticing those patterns and following those, exploring that gratification to its end, so that I wouldn't get caught in those patterns anymore because they were just making it hard to concentrate. I was, it was perpetuating anger cycles, all sorts of stuff that wasn't helpful. But until I saw that pattern, and that's what the meditation practices helped me do, is trace those mental patterns in my mind. You know, I don't know what I was doing for the previous 10 years, but it wasn't that. And it wasn't, maybe it was, practice in helping me see what wasn't helpful for meditation. But hopefully other people can learn from my experience, or probably have to learn at least somewhat from their own, that just sitting down and trying to pay attention to your breath without knowing why we're doing that may not be that helpful. Maybe for some people it is, but for a lot of people, I see it's not helpful, and certainly wasn't for me.
Yeah, and this brings us to the point where it's like if we just have one without the other, practice without the philosophy, right? We don't have the words to express, then what is our experience really at that point? I also just everything you say just reminds me so much of myself, especially in the early days with meditation, Judd. I think the first 10 years I spent having amazing $1 million ideas before I ordained, okay? And it went nowhere every single time. And I think that's actually one of the hardest things to express to people is the importance of direct experience, especially in a culture where we're so ego driven of, well, I read this or this person said this, so it must be true. And I know all of these things, but I don't need to have the experience.
Yes, it makes me think of this phrase that I've found helpful, which is concepts in the service of wisdom. So understanding the concept of dependent origination only went so far, but I had to connect that with wisdom through my own experience and being able to see, oh, pleasant leads to craving, leads to, clinging or, fueling the fire. Absolutely. Without direct experience, somebody can explain to us what chocolate cake tastes like, but if we've never tasted it, we'll never know.
So you have a question, Judd, from two of our previous interviewees. We have a little tradition here where the previous guests ask a question for the next guest. Usually,
I love that.
But you got two.
Okay.
So your first question is from Dr. Robert Harris. He's an immunobiologist in Sweden. And I'm going to quote him here. For the younger generations, the pandemic was the first real life so-called trauma or diversion from normal life that they've experienced. Compared to generations that suffered world or international wars, the trauma or the pandemic seems much less. Do you think general mental health has decreased over time in the population and that serious real-life traumas actually lead to cognitive resilience?
Well, I see how you hear at least two questions in that. I think so. Taking the first one, if I'm hearing it correctly, and maybe you could restate it, something about real. So say the first one again. I was trying to make sure I'm getting it.
So, the main point is, do you think that general mental health has decreased over time in the population?
Yes. If you look at the epidemiologic studies, and these are mostly Western based, so I should, caveat that. I don't know, what the studies haven't looked at. We've definitely seen an increase in things like anxiety, which it's hard to know unless you've lived through all these things, and then also history. It's hard to get an objective sense of history when you're living it, and we interpret it in different ways based on where we are in our life stages. Yet, if you look at one of the causes of anxiety, it's uncertainty, and the level of uncertainty from an environmental standpoint, from an economic standpoint, from a political standpoint, has certainly increased, let's say, in the last 5 years. And we've seen a concomitant increase in anxiety. If you look at the pandemic, huge spike in uncertainty, also a huge spike in anxiety. So general level of mental health, if you just take anxiety as one of the factors, certainly decreased, and there are good correlates, if not causal factors for that.
And the second part of that question, do serious real life traumas actually lead to cognitive resilience?
Well, it depends on how somebody works with that experience. So I've certainly seen in my clinical practice, I've seen people who have become very identified with or attached to things that have happened to them in the past, and certainly big traumatic events or ongoing traumatic experiences. And that has hindered them from being able to move on. Others have had, really, you could look at them and say, wow, that's, it's hard to compare people's experiences, but say, wow, that sounds pretty bad too. And they've learned from it and have become, there's this not completely scientifically validated post-traumatic growth. There's a movement around that, but I'm not sure that the science is as supportive as I think people would like. But I think it highlights how we meet our experience and importantly, our memory of those experiences. It really determines on how we grow or we shrink based on being identified with or learning from that experience or those experiences.
The memory changes over time. Oh, I feel there are so many questions to follow up on with that, but I will not for now. Maybe another time. Your next question is from Dr. Rick Hansen. So Rick asks, as for someone who knows a lot about neural correlates of meditation, how has that knowledge affected your own meditation practices?
Yeah, another great question. I would say we were doing, it was a few years ago now, we're doing a lot of work with neurofeedback. And I pilot tested all of the neuroimaging studies myself to make sure the paradigms were working. And I'm not going to have somebody do an experiment, ask somebody to do an experiment that I haven't done myself. And so I distinctly remember doing some real-time neurofeedback studies where we were looking at a particular neural correlate. The region that we were centering on was the posterior cingulate cortex, and both doing some concentration practices, but also I remember distinctly doing a loving kindness practice in the scanner where you basically get feedback, close to real time. And I remember the loving kindness, I was just doing it toward the people in the control room because they were right there. And then I just remember it getting really big and wide, and the posterior cingulate signal just like dropped out. And it was very confirmatory for just letting the practices do themselves and kind of feeling into them, that the neural correlate that we were studying, which previously where we'd studied experienced meditators and other folks, where we'd found the less people activate this network, this is self-referential network, right? So the more we get caught up in ourselves, the more it gets activated. The less we get caught up, the more it gets deactivated. And I was seeing a direct correlate that was lining up with my experience of it. It wasn't me doing this loving kindness. It was just loving kindness, like pervading, just getting wide and large. And so it was very confirmatory of, how all of these neuroscientific theories were lining up with these very ancient Buddhist practices. It was really beautiful.
Yeah, neuroscience is only now catching up, or I should say all of Western science. Let's go that far.
Yeah.
Jed, just 2 seconds. What is the one piece of research you wish to see the next generation do that has not been done within contemplative pedagogy and science?
Oh, wow. Small question, huh?
Just 30 seconds.
Yeah. It's a good question because, every experiment that I look at, it seems like a lot of the big questions have already been answered by, if you look at the Pali Canon of the Buddhist psychology. So, broadly speaking, I think we could go and look at those and kind of test those, formulate those as questions and hypotheses and test those as well. I'll say for the next generation, if you want a a low risk experiment. Go and do your own practice so you know from experience what these practices, what they're talking about, and then set a set of experiments that are good, that either prove or disprove, that have a very good hypothesis that gives you a good answer, whether it's yes or no. And so I'm not sure that there's one specific experiment that I would say, I would encourage the younger generation to do beyond do the practices and get that direct experience and then formulate the research questions from there. So I could say, oh, do this experiment, but until they know how to set it up properly and to set it up properly, at least I found it's really essential to have direct experience with it. I've seen a lot of experiments that haven't actually tested a question when they thought they've tested the question. And then it just confuses the literature where somebody says, oh, this practice doesn't work. And you go and look and they tested it, where they gave undergraduates a 15-minute guided meditation. And they say, oh, that meditation doesn't do what it's supposed to do. Well, anyway, I think you get the picture.
Thank you so much, Jed. Yes, I think today what you have done is inspire us for not only practice, but to look at what is beyond that in bringing it to the modern world. Jed, if people want to find you, how can they do so?
I have a very self-referential website that's drjudd.com. So there's a way to contact me through that. And then also, I've got a academic website at Brown University, and they can contact me through there as well.
Thank you so much, Jed, for being here today with us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.